Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's July 27th, 2024, and the right is coming back down to earth. The assumption that this election was effectively a shoo-in for Donald Trump and Republicans down ticket seems to be fading. As we mentioned last week, there has been no polling bump for Trump from the Republican National Convention, nor from the botched assassination attempt against him. Historically, parties do receive a bit of a post-convention bump, and so we would expect that Republicans would be polling best, even if ultimately they polled high enough to win. You would expect there to be a premium on top of whatever the final margin is in November at the end of July following the RNC. But tying into the lack of any sort of loss in support for Trump following the convictions in New York, and conversely, the failure for a bump to materialize for Trump after the assassination attempt and after the RNC, we're in a new era in American politics, again with the presumption in the backdrop that elections matter and that votes that are cast correspond to who ends up officially taking power in positions of elected office. Assuming that all to be true, we are in a situation now where nothing seems to move the needle electorally in one direction or another in terms of events that happen. That is to say, news events, current events, things that happen in terms of shifting demographic trends, like glaciers moving over time. They have a noticeable effect, but in terms of day-to-day changes based on what's in the headlines, the numbers just stay stubbornly the same. If vice presidential nominee announcements and assassination attempts don't move the needle a point or two in either direction, what other events will? I think it's a rhetorical question in the face of what the RCP average now shows to be a 1.7 point lead for Trump nationally, within the margin of error and also within the margin of victory that we have seen Trump enjoy for the better part of this calendar year. And that could ultimately be the saving grace, the fact that no news seems to move public sentiment in one direction or another means that if Trump has been sailing 2 or 3 points ahead for the last 6 months, then what is going to alter that course for the remaining 4 months? Is he going to sail into a 2-point national electoral advantage that manifests itself as between 60 and 100 electoral college vote margin? Possibly, though I still tend to think that is unlikely. I don't see what will change the late night vote shift total that happened in 2020 for everyone to see with their own lying eyes who was following it as we got into the wee hours of the night, where the betting markets had switched to Trump as the most likely winner of the 2020 election, and the EC map showing that he was projected to win, to these massive dumps where several states like Pennsylvania and Georgia suddenly shifted from being states that Trump was projected to win to being states that Biden had tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of votes more than Trump did. And anyone who questioned that subsequently was demonized and often destroyed, as in the cases of the hundreds of January 6th protesters who were ultimately there to, quote, stop the steal, unquote, and ended up, for nonviolent protests, ended up spending years of their lives in brutal federal prison conditions. The ground is set for all of those institutional power center machinations to repeat, but at greater intensity and with greater efficiency this time around, because the skids have already been greased. Additionally, there is the rhetorical flourish of the fact that it will be racist and misogynistic to assert that the only way the first female president of color could win is if there was cheating, and just like they did in 2020 and spreading fake news about election irregularities, well, they're back to their old playbook again in 2024, and just like it didn't work in 2020, it's not going to work in 2024. Additionally, this time around, Trump won't have the incumbency, which means there will not be the situation lending itself to a concentrated show of support, as was the case in January of 2021. There's no power center for middle Americans to converge on to air their grievances, and that is for the better for them, for their own personal fortunes, at least in the short to medium term, that they won't be in a situation that will be dealt with as harshly, if not more harshly, than it was in 2020 into 2021. In contrast to the assessment that Trump will not be permitted to win again, that the mistake that occurred in 2016 will not be permitted to happen again, no matter what the requirements to stop it are, comes from serious, long-time America First dissidents on the right who seem to have resigned themselves to Trump's installation as being a sort of fait accompli, in a very weird way, coming to the same conclusion by a different route that many of the more mainstream right, the Daily Wire, neocon, corporatized and more mainstream right that has, over the intervening 8 years, adopted MAGA rhetoric to a certain extent, but only reluctantly and never as a prime motivation driving them, but more as a polemical strategy that takes the current zeitgeist into account and utilizes it for ends that are not the ones that they are explicitly arguing for when they use the rhetoric. They too had been under the assumption that this was Trump's election to lose, but they thought it, or think it is his election to lose, for more conventional reasons than those on the dissident right do. Those dissidents perceive the support that Trump's enjoying from the old PayPal crew, from Elon Musk and from Peter Thiel and from David Sachs. They view that as evidence that the fix is in and that the establishment wants to install Trump. But I think the problem, the flaw in that perception of things is that we are used to operating under an assumption that there is more or less a unified front in the elite corridors of power or among the managerial class. However, I think what we're witnessing here, as we've mentioned previously, is a true internecine battle in the proverbial halls of power, with a rogue contingent of elites who, for a variety of reasons, are attempting to overthrow the current elite setup. The TLDR summation of which is that the golden goose is being killed, that the anti-white, anti-merit, anti-colonial rhetorical framework is jeopardizing the West's ability to maintain functioning societies that have the infrastructure and the productive economic capacity and the replacement level fertility. That's another important factor that that unites many of these oppositional elites. Elon Musk and Peter Thiel in particular have both talked about the problem with cratering birth rates in the Western world, that all of this is leading to a society that, as elites, they are unable to effectively sit atop of and project power globally to direct events at an international level. That's the purpose of being a global elite, is to have the power and influence, and more charitably, the capacity for innovation and flourishing human progression. And as the dollar teeters in the face of the Russian ruble, with sanctions directed by America and backed by the rest of the Western world being unable to have the same crippling effect on another nation's currency that the dollar hegemony used to guarantee. While at home, unhealthy, fat, distracted, DEI drowning domestic population has unlivable cities and drugged out rustics, and increasingly shows an inability not only not to innovate, but unable to even maintain what has been innovated and what has come before. In the case of the Secret Service being unable to follow the most basic and obvious protocols to prevent the perhaps most famous person in human history, the person with more potential salience in terms of being an assassination target, for the Secret Service to just utterly be incompetent and unwilling to carry out the basic tasks that are the raison d'etre of the organization, while planes are on the verge of falling out of the sky, while the Orient displaces the Occident, the leading edge of tech and high-end manufacturing, with Chinese companies like Huawei displacing Apple and BYD displacing Tesla as the leading edge of their respective industries. They're seeing this as Israel flounders in the Middle East, as Ukraine is being ground to dust, as tens of thousands of settlers and refugees from Central and South America and Sub-Saharan Africa, who do not possess, to put it mildly, the skill set that will enable companies like Apple and Tesla to regain the edge that they're losing. And so that insurgent elite faction is realizing that a real shift has to be made now, has to be effected now before it's too late. But they represent a minority of elite opinion. And while the status of being in alignment with the MAGA movement is not quite as degraded as it was 4 or 8 years ago, because of Elon Musk, really more than anyone else's, Elon Musk's deft maneuvering, his ability to take control of a substantial shaper and influencer of Western culture in taking over Twitter. While there is a little bit more room for cultural dissidents, it is still a significant demarcation of status and of career prospects in a managerial world to be associated with that elite insurgency. The preponderance of the managerial class of elite institutions and of elite money is behind Kamala Harris now. To assess that she is being set up intentionally to be some sort of sacrificial lamb seems like a misread of the situation. Though the argument could be made that her going down in defeat will evince that America is still plagued with bigotry and misogyny, and that the real implosion of the US dollar that I just cannot conceive of not taking place in the next 4.5 years during the administration of whoever the next president is, to be able to pin that all on the MAGA movement and turn the war on terror completely inward in the latter part of this crisis of the third decade that we're living through now. It is a plausible story, but I don't think it is the correct one. I don't think that the ruling power structure has that sort of long-term focus. The time horizons have been squished and becoming ever shorter and shorter in tandem with the attention spans of the smartphone addicted, social media addled American public. Moving away from the meta cultural, political, and looking instead at the more retail political and cultural happenings, The protests in the streets of the imperial capital while Bibi Netanyahu was inside addressing a majority of Congress, about half of Democrats and virtually the entirety of the Republican class, with, I believe, Thomas Massie being the lone exception, harking back to the days when Ron Paul would be the lone no vote, carrying that lonely tradition of American republicanism rather than American empire. Those protests, no doubt, confirmed to members of the elite insurgency the urgency and acuteness of the threat to Israel, by way of the threat of Israel continuing to be supplied and financed by the U.S. And while they see the threat, they no doubt also see the political opportunity and the conundrum that it puts the Democratic Party in. It is putatively going to be a tightrope that Kamala Harris is going to have to walk to avoid alienating political centrists and never Trump Republicans, while still keeping the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist left from causing too much of a scene. I don't actually think that will be very difficult for her to do. She's not going to be forced to make explicit, specific statements about anything between now and Election Day, just as she hasn't been required to do it prior to becoming vice president or at any time during her vice presidency. And there's no reason to think that that will change now with the corporate media cover that she's going to receive and the additional shields that will be provided by the woke framework that makes her effectively impervious from attacks from her left. And so after Netanyahu leaves, the protests will die down. Harris will allude to a general but amorphous shift in orientation towards Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinian conflict, and the dirtbag left that's out in the streets now calling for a ceasefire and stomping and burning the occasional American flag will fall in line electorally, as it always does, and support the lesser of two evils. As a jolting aside, it's worth going through the thought experiment of what would happen if instead of those flags being stomped on and burned, instead of them being the stars and stripes, they were the rainbow flag. The flag that more truly represents the driving motivations of the American empire as it's currently constituted. If those had been pride flags instead of flags symbolizing the pride that Middle America has, however misplaced in the empire they still perceive to be a republic, if that had been the case, the full power of the state would be brought down upon them to crush them. As is, these protests are viewed as a little bit uncouth, but ultimately something that can be managed. That's what the majority of the power structure, the elites, believe. But that is notably where the insurgent elites diverge from majority elite opinion in perceiving actions like the ones that took place in D.C. as Netanyahu spoke as being more powerful and less able to be corralled and controlled and harnessed and exploited for elite ends as had been presumed in the past. The reason this is a potential political liability for Harris and a potential point of weakness for the Trump campaign to exploit is because while Democrats by an almost 3-1 margin now say that their sympathies are with the Palestinians rather than with the Israelis, by a 2-1 margin, voters in general have their sympathies with the Israelis rather than the Palestinians. Put in another way, by a factor of 6, Democrats align more with Palestinians than the general electorate does. That's because by a 2-1 margin, moderates sympathize with Israelis over Palestinians, and by a staggering 13-1 margin, conservatives sympathize with Israelis over Palestinians. So among those in the middle, this is an issue that is clearly politically advantageous for Trump. And while Trump risks losing virtually no support at all among his base electoral support, broadly defined, those who self-identify as conservative, by offering full-throated support for Israel, there is a not insignificant contingent of pro-Israel Democrats who Harris risks potentially losing or having just not vote at all if she is perceived to be even-handed or even supportive of the Palestinian cause. On the other hand, nothing, as we alluded to earlier, nothing seems to change political polling trajectories one way or the other, irrespective of what happens or what is said. So perhaps this doesn't matter at all, or perhaps it only matters in a narrow sense in terms of, to use an elite theory lens to look at this, it only matters in the context of how it influences elites to either stick with Harris or potentially defect to join the Musk-led insurgency. One thing Team Harris might do to assuage the concerns of pro-Israel Democrats is to choose Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, the governor of Pennsylvania, as her VP. He's a pro-Zionist Democratic governor, but he is also Jewish, and so pointing out that he's pro-Zionist will be attacked as being anti-Semitic because he has that ostensibly as a member of the left in good standing culturally in terms of status. He will allow surrogates and corporate media allies, stenographers of the state, to portray criticism of America's continuing support and financing of Israel's military actions in the Middle East as anti-Semitic. And that, coupled with Kamala Harris's ambiguous rhetoric, vapidly hinting at a change in orientation, in direction, in terms of America's relationship with Israel that won't ever be borne out in terms of actual actions, but that will provide enough rhetorical cover alongside the armor, the defense, that the anti-Semitism charge that will be leveled against critics of Harris and Shapiro, that will be enough to allow the campaign to navigate the rocky waters that this particular issue presents to them. That, coupled with the conventional wisdom about picking an executive from a swing state to help shore up support from that swing state, is why I suspect that Josh Shapiro will be the VP pick. The betting markets say it'll be Mark Kelly from Arizona, but I can't shake myself from being a contrarian on this one. I think they're missing the mark, pun intended. Though those protests in D.C. were mostly peaceful, genuinely mostly peaceful, with a few minor exceptions, the destruction of a little bit of personal property and a couple of scuffles with police. Though those protests were peaceful, violence is in the air, with the assassination attempt against Trump being an especially poignant, if not isolated, example. As an aside to hearing the Congress critters grilling the hapless Secret Service clown in a startlingly bipartisan manner could be indicative of a few things. I'll start with what I think is the most naive interpretation, and that is that they really are all shocked and appalled that someone would want to do this and someone would be permitted to do this. That all the rhetoric about existential threats and the death of democracy were and continue to be hyperbolic, blowing off of steam. That strikes me as risible on its face, but maybe I'm overly jaded and overly cynical. Another potential way to read the situation is that this was the fallout of a green flag being provided to the alphabet agencies to allow organic assassination attempts to continue, or even an inside job. And so as a palliative to the shock the public experienced by that sort of assassination attempt, the bipartisan piling on of this scapegoat is a way of allaying the fears of the general public that we're on the cusp of some sort of civil war going hot, with assassins killing politicians in the streets, assassins with alphabet agency imprimaturs. A third and most compelling way to read the situation is that this hits close to home, and these people are nothing if not self-preservationists. And all these members of Congress have seen on their Twitter profiles, in the responses to their posts, some deranged and acrimonious tweets and replies that have them thinking in their darker moments, if not by the grace of God, go I. If the Secret Service can't protect Trump, what happens when I go back to my district, just one of 435 in the country, to campaign, as I have to every 2 years? What if one of those crazies does to me what he was going to do to Trump? Can I expect that I'll have the most basic precautions taken that will keep that from happening? Or is the only thing standing between me and a bullet the restraint, the self-imposed restraints of the hundreds of thousands of my constituents? If things like that can start happening to guys like me, well, I'm a guy like me. And so we're going to make sure, if there is one agency that retains the competency to execute the functions and the job duties that they're set up to do, well, that's going to be the Secret Service. But anyway, the first poll that we looked at for sympathies towards the Israelis or towards the Palestinians, that was from YouGov, looking at a survey from Reuters Ipsos, if they agreed or disagreed with the idea that, quote, to achieve my idea of a better society, violent acts are acceptable, unquote. Men are far more likely to agree with the statement, particularly young men. With those under the age of 30, men under the age of 30, 38% saying that violent acts are acceptable. For those between the ages of 30 and 39 is 29%. Between the ages of 40 and 49, 15% of men, and then it drops off from there. Among women, the highest age bracket in support of violent acts to achieve political ends was between the ages of 30 and 39 at 10%, but still significantly less support among women than among men. Breaking it down by ethnic and religious categories, 9% of whites, 16% of blacks, 20% of Hispanics, 12% of Asians, 8% of Jews, and 28% of Muslims agree with the idea that for a better society, violent acts are acceptable. That's a reality that the pro-Israel, pro-Zionists contingent in the United States, something they did to devastating effect in the aughts during the initial onset of the war on terror following 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And finally, by political orientation, violence is not a tool of the moderates. It is a tool of the, quote, extremes, unquote. Among those who lean conservative, 8% support. Of those who lean liberal, 8%. Of those who are moderately liberal, 8%. Of those who are moderately conservative, 10%. So in that broad middle, we have single-digit levels of support for violent acts as a means of effecting political change. But among those who self-describe as very conservative, it's 23%, and among those who self-describe as very liberal, it is 21%. So in some sense, when the corporate media talks about how violence is supported by extreme elements on the political fringes, and that's almost always insinuated to be on the right end of the political spectrum, though, as we see here, it just as aptly describes the left end of the political spectrum. The response in the favor of the violence supported by the extremes is that they are definitionally politically marginalized, and so the normal channels that they have to express themselves are closed off to them. And so, as the saying goes, violence ends up being the voice of the voiceless. We'll close out this week with an obituary. VDare is being shuttered, a victim of lawfare from the Attorney General's office of New York that is using the effectively bottomless coffers of the country's fourth largest state to make unending legal demands of a small shoestring non-profit advocacy organization that the organization simply cannot afford. And so rather than continuing to funnel the modest donations of middle American immigration restrictionists, or flush, rather, I said funnel, but flush those modest donations down the toilet in the face of an unending harassment campaign, VDare has elected instead to close up shop. VDare registered in New York. VDare has a separate foundation for the property in West Virginia that they purchased more recently that will continue to operate as a location for events hosted by dissidents unable to safely operate in commercial venues on account of intimidation and threats of physical violence against the venues that host them. That foundation, registered in West Virginia in friendly territory, is not under any kind of legal assault, but the original VDare Foundation, being registered in New York State, is yet another of countless examples of how location is so important and is only going to become more important as the dissolution of the United States economically, politically, culturally, and otherwise continues. Don't do things in hostile territory. Don't operate on the opposition's terrain. They are going to perceive it, not unreasonably, as an assault, and they are going to respond accordingly to repel that assault. Go where your friends are. Allow them to stay where their friends are. Everyone's better off that way. And with that, we'll sign off for this week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.